Thank you. So yeah, welcome everyone. So excited to be here talking about the State Revolving Loan Fund. I know a lot of folks are getting interested in this topic, and there's a lot to go through today. So this is the first in a series. My name is Shada Esnasheri. I am the Drinking Water Program Director here at River Network. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois. I'm going to be joined by some other facilitators here in our breakout rooms and throughout the presentation. We've also got Catherine Baer, our Vice President of River Programs at River Network, Stacy Isaac Berazar, founder and CEO of IB Environmental, and then Alana Kinnebrew, project manager at IB Environmental. So we've got a great panel of experts going to be walking us through kind of the basics of SRFs today. Before we go any further, I did just want to do a quick land acknowledgement and say that I am based in Chicago, Illinois, on the unceded traditional homelands of the Council of Three Fires. I'm sure plenty of you have seen this link before. If you are unfamiliar with the land that you are currently residing on, you can follow this link. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, get to know who's in the room and share where you are calling in from, you're welcome to do so. So just a quick note on our agenda for today. So we've already kind of run through the welcome and introduction. I'm going to go over a little bit of the need and why we're all here today. I'm sure we're all coming with our own story and experience thinking and talking about water infrastructure and familiarity with the SRFs. But I wanted to take a moment just to kind of ground us in a definition of equitable water infrastructure investment, talk a little bit about the opportunities with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. You'll hear it referred to as both IIJA and Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and a million other things probably by different people. It's all talking about the same thing, big tranche of federal funding that was authorized in November of last year. And then Alana and Stacy are really going to walk us through the nuts and bolts of the SRFs, talk a little bit about the program to date, and as well as discussing what new opportunities are available with the new funding that is available. We'll be sure to share resources throughout, but we'll share a bunch of resources at the end. I'll also do a follow-up email and do a closing and just remind you of future sessions in this series. We're hoping to make today pretty interactive, so we'll keep our eyes on the chat. There will be breakout rooms, there will be different activities, and we're really just trying to make this as useful as possible to you all. So please share your questions, your comments. Hopefully we can have some discussion throughout. So I just wanted to start with a quick poll today. Oops, actually maybe I'm sharing my screen. Erin, can you launch the poll?
Who is this, please?
I think that it is launched.
It is launched. Okay.
I saw it
Are
flash.
people seeing it?
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Okay. There we go. There it is. Now I see it. As a person sharing my screen, I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. Thank you for bearing with us. 2 years of doing this now and still figuring out the technical pieces. Yeah, just curious about your familiarity with water infrastructure, who we have in the room. It looks like we've got majority of folks that are either beginners, not as familiar with the subject, and some folks who have had some experience but looking to learn more. Not necessarily any advanced folks in the room. So that's good information for us. Great, okay, I'm gonna end the poll now. Okay, let's talk about it. So River Network developed our own definition of equitable water infrastructure investment. So we actually developed a toolkit on water infrastructure investment in the last year and a half, which if you're interested, we will share that resource it covers much beyond the SRFs, but I think this is a useful grounding piece. So our definition of equitable water infrastructure investment is when infrastructure dollars for clean water, drinking water, and stormwater are directed by the community toward public health and clean, safe, affordable, and accessible water, distributed in a way that supports low income and communities of color most at risk from environmental harms and historic lack of investment, and supporting the long-term sustainability of our waterways and water systems and utilities. And you might read this definition and say, well, yeah, duh, that's the way it should work. But I think as we go through the presentation and as you get to know kind of the process here, you'll recognize that that's not the way things have gone. So I think it's good to be clear about what we mean by equitable investment in the first place. I also just wanted to take time to acknowledge how and why a lot of us come to this. So we know that water is essential. It's an essential part of our everyday lives. When water quality and quantity are compromised, so too is our ability to move through our days. I know this has become especially important or front of mind for folks living through a global pandemic. I know we've done some work on water shutoffs and folks lacking access to running water within their homes. This has an impact on our everyday lives, and we know that it's essential to living through a pandemic and out of a pandemic as well. So just a reminder there. We also know that water service is growing more expensive. I think a common adage is that water is both underpriced and unaffordable. A lot of that has to do with the way our water systems are managed, the kind of investment that we've put into or lack of investment in our water systems and water infrastructure. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. These are the reasons that we're coming to talk about this highly technical issue of water infrastructure investment, that there are people and life underlying this issue that motivate us. We also know, I'm sure you've heard many people talking about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law. There is a ton more money flowing to infrastructure than ever before. And this is in addition to normal appropriations for water infrastructure. So the state revolving loan funds are the largest infrastructure funding source from the federal government. Congress in November did appropriate an additional nearly $50 billion to the SRFs over the next 5 years. You can see the breakdown here of what those are going toward. The last two, the $15 million for lead service line replacement and $10 million for PFAS and other emerging contaminants, are also going to be going through the SRFs. So it's a really big, exciting time, and I think a lot of people are scrambling to figure out what to do with this time and make sure that this funding flows to the communities that need it most. So with that, I think I just wanted to spotlight that there is support for a focused support for disadvantaged communities in this additional funding. And Alana and Stacy will go through this in more detail, but I just wanted to pull out a couple of things that are really significant about this opportunity. Which includes provisions like reducing the amount that states are required to match for federal funding. So their financial investment upfront is lessened, so that burden is already lessened. Issuing 49% of all funds as grants or zero interest loans, so the requirement to pay things back or the financial burden on communities, and specifically disadvantaged communities, is less. And I say as defined by states because disadvantaged communities are defined uniquely in each state. This is not a federal definition. And then also alongside the Justice 40 initiative, which is that 40% of all funds are targeted toward disadvantaged communities. So there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of excitement, but also a lot that needs to be done to ensure that these initiatives are followed appropriately and reaching the communities that need them most. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to, I don't know if it's Alana or Stacy who's taking it from here.
It's me. Thanks, Shada. Hi, everyone. Again, my name's Alana Kinnebrew. I am a project manager here at IB Environmental. And so I'll just start off by giving some background and an understanding of what water infrastructure is. So a community's water infrastructure can include all man-made and natural features that move and treat water. It's basically a network of pipes, tunnels, pumping stations, et cetera, that that treatment facilities can collect, clean, and transmit drinking water to our homes, and then at the same time collect, clean, and discharge wastewater back into the environment. Now, while historically and holistically it has all part of the same system, it is convenient to think about water infrastructure in a way that highlights drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. Elements and scale of these systems vary with each community, but understanding parts of your community system can help you understand how funding is prioritized. And beyond the recognized components that I mentioned of a water systems network, there are other tools and technologies that serve to manage supply and conserve water. So examples would be rain gardens, smart meters, groundwater aquifers, things of that nature. And these advancements and efforts can be recognized as distributed infrastructure. So in speaking of distributed and even centralized water infrastructure, the easiest way to define this, we'll start with centralized water infrastructure. And that is just basically the way systems collect, treat, and distribute water and wastewater, and it's at a centralized location. So just think treatment plants. But with distributed infrastructure, it refers to water collection and treatment that occurs at a community or service area. So it doesn't really rely on a large water or wastewater treatment plant and pumping stations to perform the same things that those plants would perform. And then green stormwater infrastructure would fall under this category. And it's an example of the distributed infrastructure, as opposed to collecting stormwater in pipes, just like drainage and things of that nature you would see on the street, and sending it to a treatment plant. Green stormwater infrastructure, it just uses natural processes to capture and slowly infiltrate water on site to prevent flooding and other sewer overflows. So that's just a basic overview of centralized and distributed water infrastructure. But feel free to visit River Network's website and pull up the Equitable Infrastructure Toolkit, because there is a glossary there that does define these things as you're going through the toolkit, which can help with that understanding. Go ahead, next slide. Thank you. Now, you do have to have an understanding of what water infrastructure is and encompasses, but now that we've kind of laid that groundwork, we need to also understand how water projects are financed. So addressing water infrastructure needs in the US, as we know, with the passing of IIJA, it's going to cost billions and billions of dollars. So luckily, that money is coming and funneling in. And although for decades, the federal government was no longer the main source of capital for water and wastewater infrastructure projects, the passing of IIJA has come at a really critical time so that we can improve the aging infrastructure. There were established funding programs at all levels of government that the water utilities could access, and we will go into that in detail. But additionally, they can explore financial strategies like bonds and fees to bring in needed resources. Next slide. So here on this side, we do have a chart that will help demonstrate the financing strategies for both federal and local levels. So on the federal side, I did want to highlight the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, because we will be talking about those extensively today. But as Shada already mentioned, those two SRF funds are receiving the bulk of the water allotted funding from IIJA. Both are getting $11.7 billion each. And that's not including the additional funding for lead service line replacement and the funding for emerging contaminants as well. So next slide. So while all those projects that were listed on that previous screen, they do have different eligibility requirements pertaining to financial status, demographics, and federal support. I do want to highlight that it also benefits socially and economically disadvantaged communities. So any well-designed federal program should aim to prioritize urban and rural communities that are less equipped to maintain and improve their water infrastructure. But with IIJA, and I know I'm going to mention this a lot, but with IIJA, the Justice 40 initiative has kind of shined a brighter light on disadvantaged communities. And they may not hit the mark on everything, but it is a step in the right direction for the federal government to help reduce the financial burden for these disadvantaged communities. Next slide.
Yeah. And Alana, I'll just add there, that's part of the responsibility of this group, not to like put too much pressure on y'all, but this is in writing, right? This is what they're saying, Justice 40 is supposed to do. And it's kind of on all of y'all on here to give them good examples and suggestions and hold them accountable for really meeting that mark in a robust way. So anyway.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stacey. So there are other ways to improve equity and affordability. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of these as an example. Now, assist communities that do not have robust asset management plans or shovel-ready projects. And by this, these communities could lack capacity to develop resources that should not be excluded from infrastructure funding. So rather, they should be provided with the resources and knowledge to develop management best practices and build capacity. With weighing criteria that aren't directly related to water infrastructure, funding projects in areas with little green space. So as I was talking about earlier with distributed infrastructure, those would be ways in which the weight can be altered. Account for capacity to submit a competitive proposal. So if available money is limited and communities lack sufficient administrative capacity to compete with better resourced communities, then they're less likely to secure funding, which is unfortunate. But developing or designating targeted financing opportunities for low income and disadvantaged communities can neutralize such competition and thus ensure equity goals can come from funding decisions. Lastly, offer a comprehensive and technical support as part of project funding. So low capacity communities often need help navigating grant requirements. So providing planning, implementation, and monitoring assistance is also beneficial and can better assure project tracking and outcomes to gain financing. Now, as an advocate, you can encourage your state to take a very thorough approach to the EPA infrastructure needs survey and assessment, which I will speak on later on, but that is a way for states to emphasize their need and demonstrate a need for additional funding for water infrastructure capital projects. Next slide. Now, the overarching goal of many federal water infrastructure investment policies and programs is to make financing accessible and inexpensive, right? So utilities should not be compelled, because of that, utilities shouldn't be compelled to implement steep rate increases, and affordability outcomes can improve overall. Now, Federal money for water projects tends to come through WRDA, or Water Resource Development Act, and it's typically passed every 2 years, and it includes significant changes related to water utility financing. Now, given that it's passed fairly regularly, these acts can serve as a great organizing and anchoring point for advocates to align outreach with WRDA developments and contact federal legislators during these times to voice concerns and suggestions. So that is a key. Next slide. Now, with federal funding for clean water, State Revolving Fund, and drinking water State Revolving Fund, I do want us to look specifically at how the funding looks normally and currently, and then how IIJA funding has kind of changed some of the normal day-to-day. So together, the clean water and drinking water SRFs are the largest source of federal funding for water infrastructure. And every year, Congress puts aside capitalization grants to fund these SRFs. And in order to receive the grant, states are expected to provide a 20% match of the allotment. And this match cannot be other federal funding. So they have to find these funds elsewhere, not through federal means. But with the passing of IIJA, the state match has been reduced down to 10% versus the 20%. Now, while EPA supplies and manages the state revolving funds, they're administered at the state level. And each state has a different organization that will run the program. Sometimes clean water SRF and drinking water SRF in your state could be run by a completely different department or organization. So definitely note that. But it functions, these SRFs function as a loan program, and they're considered revolving because the state can use the interest that the borrowers repay to make new loans. So theoretically, the SRF dollars should exist in perpetuity. Now, generally, to be eligible for SRF capital, a project must be accounted for in the intended use plan. So inclusion in an intended use document is definitely critical in order to receive funds. There are limited federal guidelines for how a state must administer its SRF program, and each state creates its own selection process to determine which projects it will fund. Certain projects may have a bigger priority in certain states versus others. For example, in Florida, there could be a project that has to do with saltwater intrusion that would receive higher priority than in Kansas. Kansas doesn't have to worry about saltwater intrusion, so they wouldn't prioritize that type of project. Now, public participation is a key stipulation, and states are required to seek public review and comment and include a draft that's included in their draft intended use plan. So states engage public mainly by releasing public notices that explain how to access their IUP, and then they also share the dates for those public meetings so that they can receive input, public input, and then they'll outline the process for submitting comments. So with that, as I was discussing an IUP, I would like to demonstrate for you all how to actually find your own state's intended use plan. So I'm going to share my screen here.
And as Alana's pulling that up, you know, that opportunity to give feedback on the intended use plan is really invaluable. So you want to make sure that you take advantage of that opportunity to give your input.
All right, so if you do not know how to pull up your state's intended use plan, I do just want to demonstrate how easily you can find it. I am going to be using Alabama as an example. And I'll just type in intended use plan. And in my search now, initially it does bring up specifically the drinking water intended use plan, but I'm going to go to their State Revolving Fund main page. That's what this link is here. And as I mentioned before, some states, their State Revolving Fund for clean water is run by one department and drinking water could be run by a different department. In this instance, the Department of Environmental Management runs both clean water and drinking water for the state of Alabama. So typically on their SRF webpage, you will find additional information about the State Revolving Fund. Sometimes they have little brochures that will break down the information, highlighting the benefits of an SRF loan, a general list of eligible projects that can receive funding for SRFs. But also they give details on how to apply. And down here with their reports, they have their intended use plan and their annual report. Now, the intended use plan is what we have been highlighting. The annual report would instead show what projects have actually received the funds. The intended use plan is for projects that are have filled out a pre-application and are intending on applying for SRF dollars. So we'll just pull up the 2021 drinking water intended use plan just briefly. Now for Alabama, it's about 22 pages, so not that long, but just an overview here of what you can find, general background on the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, how much Alabama is receiving, applying for, because it's the intended use plan. So how much they're applying for, some of their goals for use of the funding, short-term and long-term goals, so that you can see what direction they are looking to go towards, sources and uses of funds, so how that state match is called out in there. And then as we continue down, they do highlight the eligible projects to be funded in their state. So again, this could slightly vary by state. And then there is a section for priority listing. So in each intended use plan, the states do prioritize which projects will actually receive funding. And so, sorry, let me just scroll down to a lot of great detail in here. Okay, so the project priority list will show county or utility that is applying for funding and what that would qualify under, what type of, sometimes they'll give detail on what type of project, the amount of the project, then in annual reports, they'll say how much they were approved for, but it is a hierarchy, a prioritization process, and it all depends on the affordability in that area. There are different ways to measure that. So each state has their way of ranking and distributing those funds. So I did just want to give that brief example. Stacey, did you have anything else to point out with the intended use plan?
No, I just tried to give people a heads up in the chat that they need to pull one up soon and do this exercise. So they better be paying attention. But no, it's a useful document. And I think I will add one thing though, Alana, that if a project is not listed on the intended use plan, you're not going to get it funded through the SRF. Now the state can be flexible and they can edit or amend, the intended use plan to put your project in. But it's really important to get it in there. And so probably the next attachment Alana is going to show you is like a pre-app, whatever process your state has to get on that intended use plan you want to be aware of, and any projects that you're working to advocate for, whatever, they need to be listed on there. Some states have a much more formal process for even getting on this in the IUP, and other states are a little bit like, at one point, some states, you just call them and tell them, I think I want to do a stormwater project, in Fayette County, and they'll put something on there and you have a chance. But it's almost like you don't have a ticket if you don't get listed somewhere in this IUP. And that PPL that Alana was showing before are the projects that have a higher chance of getting funded, or the state has agreed to fund, right? But somewhere in here, you need to get that project that you have, that pet project that you want to get funded.
Yes, and the Alabama does list their pre-application in here, just so you can see what types of questions that need to be filled out and answered, so that they get on the project is put on the priority listing in the IUP. So I know some states do have electronic versions of their pre-application. It is 2022, so a lot of organizations are moving away from, filling out a PDF or what have you. It'll be through an online server, but either way, there is a pre-application that is filled out with additional details about how much, what the project is, a description of the project, things of that nature, so that, again, it is put on in the IUP. Now, with that, I did want to jump to our group activity now that I've gone through the IUP.
Hey, Alana.
Yes.
We just got two quick questions, and
Oh, sure.
just about how does the public comment appear to the draft of the IUP? Like, is it a certain set, or is it how many of them are there? And then also another question about, does the National Environmental Policy Act apply to projects under the SRF?
So, and I was just starting to answer that, although that second one in the chat, KB. So yeah, so just to be, completely transparent, one of the downsides of getting federal funding is what they call the cross cutters or the red tape or hoops to jump through, take your pick, right? But one of it is that you have to meet these criteria for the National Environmental Policy Act, or whatever version of it is in your state. You'll have to do some environmental review. There are, what do they call them? Categorical exclusions in some cases, where the project, like, say you're replacing maybe drinking water meters, but that's not going to have an impact per se on the environment, or even historical stuff like tribes and that kind of thing. You can get an exclusion there, but all of these projects generally have to go through some sort of environmental review to answer that one. And KB, you might need to repeat the first one. I didn't even see that in the chat. Can you tell us what that first question was again?
Yeah, it's a question about do they have to have a public comment period on the draft of the IUP? Everything you've talked about, but can you talk about that a little bit more, what that looks like and when?
You want to try that one, Alana, and I'll add anything else?
That was the one I remembered, and I was going to try to tag you in on that one, not
Okay.
the second one. So sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so they are supposed to offer an opportunity for comment, and that's what Alana was talking about on the draft intended use plan. And then based on those comments, incorporate some of the feedback, at least where possible, and then have the finalized one. So yes, there is an opportunity. I want to say like maybe a minimum of 30 days. Don't quote me on that. And then again, it depends on the state. So some states are more generous, if you will, and they'll give more time. Also, especially with the pandemic too, we're seeing, I know one state SRF program said that they will never again just have one in-person opportunity to comment on their intended use plan. They've had people, because they had to move it online, who have been so grateful and so useful, so grateful to be able to comment. So look out for other opportunities beyond a 1-hour meeting in a certain federal building one time for the year. And then you should be able to, submit written comments in a 30-day period or whatever. But just look out for the states being a little bit more innovative on how they collect that feedback or how they solicit it.
All right, so we are going to jump into the first activity. So if, I believe those are the breakout rooms. So if you could share your screen again, Shada, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and while, you know, it's really tough to be doing these transitions and everybody looking at you. So I will fill in when we have that. There's a question about, is there a landing page? And I think y'all will have access to these slides if you don't have them already. On I think maybe 3 slides ago, Alana showed sort of a slide with 2 columns. One was the current, you know, SRF setup, and then what's looking like is going to happen with IIJA. Yeah, that one. And that link there is a really good resource that River Network has put together. And it could answer Sonia's question about, thanks Erin for popping it in there too, on how it's pretty easy to find the information to contact your state's SRF program. So, and therefore, when you get to the state's website, you should be able to find the IUP reasonably easily as well. But good question, Sonia. I think you know the activity that's coming up here. You have a crystal ball.
Yeah, so we're gonna move you into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes, and this is really just meant to be an opportunity to find your IUP, go through some of these questions, and if you want to just put your head down and do it, or rely on folks in the breakout room to have some discussion support with anything you're finding. It's really just meant to be an activity time, an exploration time, and then we'll come back and maybe debrief a little bit what you were able to find, what you were unable to find, questions that came up, but these are sort of some guiding questions, and we should have some facilitators in the room, and we'll be popping in to help as needed. So I'm going to send you off in just a second, unless there are any quick questions I can answer before we do that.
Jada, how long did you say we have in these rooms?
10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to open all of the rooms now. And the questions should be in the chat for you all. Hey, Melanie. Did you get assigned to a breakout room or no?
I joined late, so maybe not.
I'm going to throw you in a breakout room. We're just going through, do you see the questions in the chat related to IUP? So it's similar to what we did in the boot camp, but
I was going to say, yeah, I feel like I've done this before, but I didn't find the intended use plan, so it could be good to try again.
Yeah. I'm going to move you into room.
Cool.
Shada, am I breaking everything by not going to the breakout room?
No, I don't think so. I was wondering if you were still walking.
Yeah, we just.
Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. I did just want to provide some space for any questions or interesting things that came up in that process. How did it go?
I found that switchboard site that Victoria shared in the chat to be really helpful. And I was also just kind of surprised that like so many of the intended use plans and things were like, seemed kind of out of date. Like there wasn't current information. I was surprised about that.
I'll say
Yeah.
for the group that I
Go
was
ahead.
in, we pulled up Pennsylvania's website where their intended use plan is, but it was, I think, partially shocking and partially not surprising that they had a document for public comment and there was one page, which was the cover page. So there was no public comment that had been submitted for the draft of the intended use plan. So I think that just goes to show how important it is for this information to be shared and everyone to know where to go, who to contact, so that, you know, there is public comment submitted.
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna, I work in Pennsylvania some too, and what's partly frustrating for me is I don't, unlike other parts of the Clean Water Act processes, you can find the sort of the methodology and sort of the timeline for when these things happen on an annual basis. I can't find that for the intended use plan, right? Like, I don't know when they normally have their, you know, draft out for public comment. You know, like I have to look at an old one to see, oh, the public comment happened then, I should start looking for it then, right? Like, it's not obvious on the website at all when, what that process is and when it's going to happen.
Yeah, I'll second that. We had a couple of folks from DC and we were looking at the intended use plan for DC, and it has a, you know, it's like 3 pages and it has a link for more information about everything. Click this link and it takes you to DC Water's capital improvement plan, which is 350 pages, and you could control F for public, for comment, for hearing, and still not get information that each project on the list has its own hearing and the intended use plan has its own hearing. Like, none of that stuff is in the 350 pages. So, and that's DC, which is a smaller place. So even with helpful websites like the Switchboard, I think we should all be prepared to go on a little bit of a wild goose chase.
I think it's also important to note that utilize the contact information for those that are in charge of running the state's SRF program. Because if I, as an individual, am constantly getting questions about where to find certain things on the website, that's taking away from me working on, you know, getting this capital funding out or processing an application, things of that nature. So that could help improve the website and make it more user-friendly. Because if no one's truly utilizing the website, what incentive do they have to make things more readily available and easily accessible, you know? So I think it is important to utilize reaching out to those resources so that, you know, you can get those dates on a calendar, making sure that, you know, your community is doing what they can to get the additional information that's necessary. And
Yeah,
Shayda, thank you for dropping those links. Go ahead, Stacey.
I'm trying to keep up with the chat a little bit here. So I'll type when I can, but so Jack is asking about the CE process or the categorical exclusion. And the short answer is it depends on the state, which is why we're taking you all through this exercise of trying to find stuff on your state website, right? It's a blessing and a curse that the federal government tells the state you have a lot of free will or leeway, I should say, in how you design your program. So some states are more generous with the categorical exclusion. I mean, it's more work for them to do a comprehensive, you know, environmental check. So it depends on the state. Let me see what types of projects generally do receive.
Yeah, that would be great if you could even just talk about a little bit, like what kinds generally do receive that categorical exclusion.
Okay, so again, with the caveat that it depends on the state, basically it's the projects that I've seen terms like don't disturb land, right? Like, so remember my meter replacement idea that I told you? I guess somebody could ask about, well, how are they going to dispose of the old meters and how's that going to affect the environment, right? But in most cases, that meter replacement would be a CE project, which is why those projects, meter replacements in particular, was so very, very popular with the last time we had a tranche of funding like this. So in the days of ARA around 2009, a lot of the additional funds went to things like meter replacement because they didn't have to go through the categorical, they didn't have to go through, sorry, the environmental review process. They were excluded. So stuff that doesn't disturb the land is usually, I guess, the best rule of thumb that I can give on that. Let's see. Victoria is asking about how we can improve that public input process. I'm gonna say, you know, that example that Alana just gave, I mean, it's really underutilized. Nobody shows up to these things. And even in the case of the example that y'all brought up in your breakout group, Alana, if some group had sent in written comments, I would think it would have appeared in that document. So I want to put a little pressure on this audience and say, you know, y'all can probably do better in terms of giving the input. But if there are states that are not doing a good job, you could ask them to increase the length of the period of time for public comment. I've seen some states like lean towards making that longer. And then this idea, you know, the SRF example, the story I heard from an SRF manager, so that was really powerful. He's the one who said, we will never do this again. There was a gentleman in his state who his dream in life apparently was to attend one of these public hearing processes on the SRF program. And he said it was a 2-hour drive for him one way to come to the hearing. And then it would be a 2-hour drive back the other way. And so he was so glad to be able to give comments and be part of the process on a virtual platform. And so that SRF director said, we will never again, just only offer this one, you know, this in-person meeting opportunity. So doing it online, but there are most of them, if you send written comments in, they'll, you know, they have to acknowledge those, but we don't even see that in a lot of states. Like nobody even sends a letter in.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah,
I
please.
will say that I would also encourage you all to look on the website and see if they have an option to sign up for email newsletters, if they are on LinkedIn, if that department is on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, what have you. Start following them, because a lot of times when that public comment period comes up, or when the call for projects window opens, things of that nature, those big announcements, they may publish them on one of those platforms or send an email. So it could be helpful, so that way you're able to keep up and not having to sift through the weeds on the website, so that you know when that opportunity comes up, you know, via email or via tweet.
And I'm seeing a really great suggestion that maybe some of your organizations could take on, is like these one-pagers. So maybe you can ask the state to do it, right? To put together a one-pager on critical dates and, you know, and deadlines and that kind of thing. But maybe your organization does it and shares it out, right? So I'm seeing this one-pager stuff. Let's see. Stacy, I believe, was in Oregon, because she was in my group and we pulled up. Well, no, I might be getting, yeah, I think so. Anyway, somebody's asking, Stacy's asking about SRFs and do you have to be a utility or a municipality? Good question. Some states will not use SRF funds for privately owned entities. They will not fund nonprofits, and some states do. So again, you know, it's the beauty of the SRF where the state gets to decide. But you'll have to check that out for your particular state. So for instance, Alana and I are in Georgia, and they know exactly how many clients they have to market to for the SRF, because it's only you know, publicly owned, it's city and utility. And if there's a special district that the state created, right? But it's local government owned entities. No other entity can really apply for the SRF program in that state, in the state of Georgia. I don't know about Oregon exactly.
Awesome. So if that's all the questions at the very moment, we can always jump back to Q&A, but I want to jump back to the presentation. Thank you, Shada. Awesome. So it really is important to note that there are slight differences between the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And these three listed here are the main differences. So project type, allocation process, and then program set asides. Next slide. Awesome. So the clean water SRF is used mainly for wastewater systems and non-point source projects. And then the drinking water SRF is designed to help drinking water systems meet federal water regulations. Next slide. The Safe Drinking Water Act has created or built this formula for deciding what percentage of funds from the drinking water SRF goes to specific states. And so every 4 years, utilities receive an infrastructure needs survey and assessment, and it covers the next 20 years. And utilities that actually utilize resources like asset management and capital improvement planning processes, they'll be the ones that have the more reliable numbers for that survey, and in turn will be able to depict a more accurate need. The last survey that took place covered from January 2015 to December of 2034, and it found that water utilities needed about $470 billion in infrastructure investment. Now, I mean, that's likely a really, really conservative estimate because many utilities don't engage in a comprehensive planning process. And then also at that time, green infrastructure and source water protection projects may not have been sufficiently represented in that survey. And emerging infrastructure challenges like lead in pipes and PFAS, they were not represented in this survey, and they weren't as prominent at that time when this survey took place. But states received at least 1% of total drinking water SRF dollars, and the more that the state is able to demonstrate the need, like I mentioned, but in comparison to other states, the larger their allocation will be. So as an advocate, you can encourage your state to take advantage of a very thorough approach with their survey. And on the EPA website, they do have the results from the most recent infrastructure needs assessment so that you can find out how the EPA has allotted drinking water SRF funds to the different states. So you can see how your state fared out compared to another one. Now with clean water, next slide. Yes. So the Water Quality Act of 1987 outlines the original clean water SRF allotments, but in the year 2000, the formula changed slightly, but the basic allocation remained pretty much the same. The criteria used to establish the allotments, however, are unknown. So there isn't a clear-cut understanding of the allotment like it is for the drinking water SRF. An EPA Clean Water Needs Survey is conducted, and I do not know, and Stacey, you can jump in if you know, but I don't know how often the clean watershed needs survey takes place.
Yeah, that's about every 4 or 5 years too, I think.
Okay, around similar to drinking water. Thank you. And so for many years, it's been recommended that the results from the clean water SRF allotment process, that the survey be used to impact the clean water SRF allotment process, but it's currently just an ongoing discussion. It still hasn't been set in stone as of yet. But just so you know, you can access mapping tools and other data from the 2012 survey, which can give some background on reported needs of your individual states. So that information is available online. Next slide. Awesome. So we do have another activity for everyone. we do ask that everyone visit menti.com and you will input that code on your screen. Or if you want to just use your phone, you can hold up your camera to that QR code and it will take you to the website. But for this activity, we would like everyone's input and so that we can see if you guys are following along and listening to our cues, especially after going through the intended use plan, but input the types of projects that could fall under the categories of receiving funding from the clean water SRF versus the drinking water SRF. So we're going to start off with the drinking water SRF in your state. So what types of projects are eligible to receive that funding?
Alana, could you share the code one more time for the Menti site?
I'll read it off. It's 5270079. It's also in the chat.
Thank you.
No problem.
And this seems like a really wicked exercise for us to have you all do, because I didn't know that the most frequent question, at least in our breakout group, was where can you find eligible projects? I have not been able to find the eligible projects from my state. That's what I kept hearing, and I've seen a couple questions in the chat. So yeah, we took the question that you all have on your minds and are looking for the answer for, and we made it into an exercise. So you get to answer your own question here, but yeah, well, it's useful. I think it's in hindsight, it was probably a good question to choose.
Awesome. I see the answers rolling in. So I just want to call out some, and then we can have discussion on whether or not it may fall under drinking water SRF. So we have lead service line replacement. I see that a couple times. Water main rehabilitation. Let me make my screen bigger. Sorry, guys. Awesome. PFAS remediation, lead service line, water efficiency, drinking water pipe replacement, emergency power, projects to correct acute health hazards, wastewater projects. Now, I did want to re-emphasize to everyone that this is specifically drinking water. We will have an opportunity to input clean water projects that could receive funding in your state, but this is specifically drinking water. And so not to be confused, because clean water, I know when I came into the water industry, I immediately would think clean water, that's what I can use out of my tap, but clean water is wastewater. So just keep that in mind. So wastewater projects wouldn't fall under receiving funding for drinking water SRF. Okay.
Right, and I don't know if the Menti allows people to delete stuff or not. So, but it's a good, just a good point of discussion here. So we see lead service line replacements are very popular, right? And I'll just put a little twist on that. I've talked to some even utility managers who say, no, we can't. We are not going to borrow money from the SRF to replace lead service lines because it's not equitable, because only some of our customers have lead service lines, and we would be borrowing money from the state to replace lines for only some of our customers. And the way our resources work, we're not going to be able to only, basically all our customers will be paying to replace the lines for some of the customers as we repay the loan. So, don't be surprised if you hear something like that out there, even though I say, well, the federal government has listed lead service line replacement projects as eligible under the SRF. All utilities will be paying back the loan the kind of way that you would at your utility. So maybe you should rethink it a little bit, but there's a continuum, right? There's a spectrum as to where people fall. And these are actual utilities that say that. So they would like to take lead service line replacement off the list and see it as a private homeowner issue still. So, but we are making, I think, a lot of progress on that. So I would say generally, like Alana was alluding to, the wastewater project one I would take off of this because that should be probably on the next Menti slide. And then the stormwater projects, that stormwater is a big term, so it could be, you know, there's certain types of green projects or energy
Every Friday,
efficiency.
ranchers around South Dakota.
There's certain types of energy efficiency projects, etc., that would fit under both drinking water and clean water, SRFs, right? But generally, most stormwater projects would fit in the clean water bucket. So that would be on the next slide or whatever. So.
Awesome. So same code, you all should see the option to input what projects are eligible through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund for your state. So go ahead and input those responses specifically for clean water SRF funding.
And just to remind you, we're seeing a lot of good comments and resources that you all are providing to each other in the chat. So Massachusetts has some good, they have a trust for service line replacement. So some states have been out in front of this issue. You all have heard of Denver, Colorado. They just kind of went ahead and took care of the problem and, you know, figured out a way to fund it before waiting on different information from the federal government, for instance. Yeah, and Julian has pointed out a 2017 guidebook from EPA on drinking water state revolving fund eligibility. One of the things, and I'll get into this, I'll wait, I'll get into that drinking water eligibility a little bit more later on, but how's this looking, Alana? They getting these right?
So for the clean water, we have aquifer projects. Can anyone confirm for them? Because I see a question mark, so they were a little unsure when they submitted that. Is anyone willing to come off mute and confirm whether aquifer projects would fall under clean water SRF? Any brave soul?
That's a controversial one. Maybe that's what the question mark's about. In that, yeah, states don't know if to mess with that or not. And then if you talk about something like aquifer storage and recovery, where you pump water into the aquifer and kind of keep it there, so it's not in a lake and evaporating, then that gets even more controversial. But
yeah, so I think that's one that would kind of depend on your state, and I think it also would depend on what the specific project would entail, because it is a little broad for aquifer projects. But we have green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure planning and implementation, brownfield remediation, protection of estuaries, water treatment, septic to sewer, non-point source, combined sewer overflows, stormwater and water conservation, setting up a water utility to collect fees. I might need a little more to that one.
I'm guessing that means setting up a stormwater utility, probably, but.
Okay. Got it. Green infrastructure, stormwater and wastewater, non-point source pollution management, and sewer rehab and phosphorus. I think it's cut off, but yeah.
So septic to sewers is important. Oh, there's more. Wow. You guys are doing, yeah, we may not be able to comment on all of these. So the septic to sewer thing is a big problem, right? I mean, it used to be every month. I can almost say now every week at IB Environmental, we get an email or a call from somebody who has a septic failing, a customer or a homeowner with a failing septic system, and they don't know what to do. And it's just a messed up system, because that failing septic tank is leaking into the nearby water and causing the local utility to probably get fines or not meet their thresholds and the regulations, right? But it's a private system, so they don't have, their hands are tied, they would say. So septic to sewer systems are really, I don't know. I think that's something that y'all should consider if you have water quality issues in your state, because there are very few good financing mechanisms that the homeowners can tap into. So that's something that we do a lot of work on and trying to find good solutions there. So there are a couple programs that USDA has, for instance, that have expanded. So they used to only fund private wells, and now they fund septic repair. So anyway, that's a big one, I would think. We're going to assume, so in terms of eligibility, SRF programs are not supposed to fund what we call O&M, or operation and maintenance. They're capital or infrastructure type projects. How we define infrastructure is very broad, or it should be very broad, like Alana went through at the beginning. So it could be a pipe from a wastewater treatment plant, but it could also be things like rain gardens, bioswales, and that disconnecting downspouts. All of those things should be in the mix as well.
So Stacy from Oregon left a comment in the chat, and she said, in Oregon, agencies say that we have very few lead service lines and that the problems are all in fixtures and buildings. Do any of the examples of funding lead service lines you're all sharing apply to pipes/fixtures in buildings? That is a very good question.
Yeah, anybody who put service line, lead service line replacement in there, want to comment on that? Just hop off of mute.
Well, I just want to agree, because Doris, you know Doris Stacy, she's from Oregon, and she talks about the same thing, that there are places that don't have problems with lead service lines. It's the lead that's in the fixtures that are inside the house. And that kind of goes along with this idea that we've heard with LIWAP, that maybe people have a high water bill because they don't have a good toilet, they've got leaky pipes. So going into a person's home to fix an environmental problem is a problem waiting for a solution.
I'll jump in and add that to Stacy's question, I haven't heard of any type of funding for LSL replacements relating to fixtures in the homes. It's more about the service line itself. Yeah, because then it becomes definitely more of what someone was saying earlier in terms of like replacement in private property. And I think at the moment, because certain states definitely have a lot of service lines still, I feel like in the advocacy space around these lead issues, these lead pipes, the focus is on getting those pipes out and then moving toward addressing the issue in fixtures. But that's my understanding.
That makes a lot of sense, Jen. Yeah,
that does.
Anthena, you have, somebody has their hand up. Anthena has a hand up. Maybe that's by mistake. But if you, yeah, go for it.
On purpose, thank you. Anthena Gore, water programs team at Elevate based in Chicago. I just wanted to readdress Stacy's question. It's a problem here too, and we've had, unfortunately, a number of people who have been cut off of water before the moratoriums went in place in Chicago. So as a nonprofit, we've been going out to homes and trying to get people reconnected. So we actually received private grant funding to replace leaky water infrastructure in the home. So we can do toilets, water heaters, we can do some pipe replacement, etc. We are trying to understand if there is a place where ARPA funding is coming through our municipality that we can activate for that type of programming to expand. So if that's a conversation that you can have with your municipality or water utility, that may be worth the conversation to explore how partners can get together and start helping homeowners.
That's really great information. Thanks for jumping in with that. Here's my take. This is kind of maybe oversimplifying things, but if I have a crystal ball, and I don't, there's so much funding that's coming down the pipe right now that I would like to think people are going to, utilities are going to come to you, the state is going to come to y'all and say, what kind of project should we fund? How can we change the way we've done things so that we can spend this money and not give it back? And when you give it back, then other states can get your money. And that's just really, nobody wants that, right? Every state wants to be able to use the money that they allocated. So I would like to think projects that had a red flag before or just weren't given the green light, that your states are going to be more open. That's just very general, you know, what I want to encourage y'all about. So this is a lot of the septic, the private well, that may have emerging contaminants, and this lead service inside the house stuff, they're all related in a way. Historically, local governments or these utilities are publicly owned, and they prefer not to get involved with your private property. That's going out the window. And we have, you can use, all of these are linked in that. That's the threshold, right? Like crossing over from the public right away or whatever into personal property. But that's been crossed. So yeah, and there are ways to do it. So the example that Anthony just mentioned is a good one. There are some utilities with their customer assistance programs, they don't only help you with a bill, they will also go in and replace leaking toilets. I mean, why have a customer who can't afford the bill have a higher than needed bill because they have leaking fixtures or not high efficient fixtures? So they can't afford the bill already, and we're losing the resource, right? So it's we're not practicing water efficiency or conservation. So some utilities have found ways around that. Sometimes just high level, it involves a third party, like maybe the utility staff won't go in and replace the lead service lines themselves in a house, or sorry, the fixtures in the house, but they will. Sometimes it's just a little bit more palatable to them to get funding from, say, CDBG, which stands for Community Development Block Grant Program, and then hire like a third party to actually go into people's houses. So we're probably needing to move along here. I don't know. Yeah.
Real quick, just, we'll get back on track and we'll continue on with the presentation, but I dropped in a link for a blog post that I wrote touching on lead service line replacements, and KB, she dropped a link as well for the lead service line replacement collaborative. Both highlight, now the lead service line collaborative is a whole webpage dedicated to lead service line replacement, but I did include examples of cities that went into homes and actually replaced the lead service lines that are in the homes versus just up to the line, as you would say. So there are instances where locations will actually go into the home, but again, a lot of times, like Stacey was kind of mentioning, they're hiring third parties to come in and complete that work, and not necessarily the utility themselves. So.
And sometimes it's nonprofit organizations like y'all, or ones that you have, you have relationships with.
Yes. Awesome. So Shada, do you mind pulling the slideshow back up? Awesome. So Stacey is now going to start talking about the set-asides.
Yeah, and I'm gonna jump back a little bit to not where the slides are concerned, but eligible projects or project eligibility has been coming up a lot today. And so I'll try to spend more time on that in these slides, although they weren't exactly designed for that, right? So a reminder, it kind of depends on your state, but where you can, go to EPA's website, go to EPA's landing page on SRFs, and pull out a couple, compare the federal list of eligible projects. For example, Julian sent out something for drinking water. That was from 2017, but compare that federal list to your state list and ask questions of, well, we really think, as a watershed group, for instance, that we need more rain gardens in our state. We've done research or whatever, and we know, I'm not the science engineering type, but I'm just gonna say we realize that we need more rain gardens. How come that's not pulled out in our state eligible list, right? So kind of hold them accountable for why they're not, being broader. Let's say if something is listed as an eligible project on the federal list and it's not on your state list, ask some questions about that, right? So you all have figured out by now there are two SRFs, like Alana mentioned, the drinking water one, which is what comes out of the tap, and the clean water one, which is really wastewater or stormwater, right? There's talk of a third one. There's some folks lobbying for a third SRF fund. So let's see who can drop in the chat first. What would be the third SRF? We have drinking water already, we have clean water. put it in the chat what you think the third one would be. And we'll send, we're limited in throwing out candy or whatever here, but all right, people are being a little bit slow with that. Wastewater specific, sort of, yeah. So stormwater advocates are saying, well, there's a drinking water one and there's a wastewater one. We need a separate stormwater SRF, and they have good information, and it's partly on us here on this call. If you look at the percentage of SRF clean water funds that have gone to stormwater projects, it's very, very small. So they're saying, people are only going to the clean water SRF for like traditional wastewater type stuff. And so we need our own stormwater SRF. So we'll see where that goes. Just putting that on the horizon. Now, with the drinking water stuff, the drinking water SRF, there are certain types of projects that are not eligible. And maybe that's another way to look at it, right? So let's just maybe we could assume that everything's on the table if it has to do with drinking water, except you are not supposed to use the drinking water SRF to what they call fund growth. So you're not supposed to run lines out to a whole sort of undeveloped area with the SRF funds and then hope that houses come, right? So that's one thing that has been, they've been historically against with the drinking water SRF. Now, with ARPA funds, which is not what we're talking about here very much today, there have been like the final rule, if you're tracking at the local level with ARPA funds, it seems like they've relaxed that a little bit on the drinking water SRF side, but generally it's not supposed to fund growth is the term that we use. The other thing that they're not supposed to fund is operation and maintenance. So paying your water operators and buying, I don't know, oil for the pipes, that kind of stuff is not supposed to be through these programs. So yeah, that's one way to look at it too, like what's not eligible and sort of assume everything else is if it relates to drinking water or clean water, right? One of the differences between the drinking water SRF, so none of that was on this slide right now that I just said. When we come to the drinking water SRF, one of the differences between the clean water and drinking water is that there are these set-asides as built into the drinking water SRF, which do not exist on the clean water SRF side. And these set-asides are a great mechanism that the federal government has used in the past, back in 2009 with ARA, to sort of encourage or prioritize certain types of projects, right? So states can set aside around 31% of their grants, right? So of the whole drinking water SRF that the state gets, they can put aside up to 31%. Most states don't set aside that. What we mean by set aside. So all of this money, the 20% that the state throws in and what the federal government gives are basically used for low interest loans for water projects, right? You all seem to get that. You're wondering which kinds of projects are eligible. However, with the drinking water SRF, they say not all of the money has to go out as low interest loans. You can keep some for special projects. You can set it aside. For instance, 4%, and we can go to the next slide, I think here, Shada. Yeah, for instance, you'll see later on too in the pie chart. Skip to the next one, please, Shada. In the drinking water SRF, they say that 4% can be used to sort of administer the project. 2% is set aside. The lightest blue that you see there is the small system technical assistance set aside. So we know that the smallest system lack what we call in this field. They don't have the technical, financial, and managerial capacity to really run their systems properly, to borrow money, to fill out applications and that kind of thing for loans, right? So that's 2% doesn't have to go to a specific utility in the state for a specific project. It goes to pay some nonprofit organization that's a water association that helps all of the smallest systems in the state. So that's the 2% set aside. The biggest one is the 15% set aside. That goes, it's for local assistance and other state programs, and it's looking like source water protection is listed in there by the federal government as one of the things that 15% set aside could be used on, used for. They're good fit when multiple utilities want to merge. So again, the set asides go to kind of benefit the entire state, if you will, or a big group of systems in the state instead of a loan to one specific utility. So that's one way to look at it. Can you go back to that map slide, please, Shada? I'm keeping you on your toes. All right. So this is just one example of what some states have used some of their drinking water SRF set aside funds for. So all the blue ones on here happen to be states that the Environmental Finance Center based at UNC, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, they have done rates dashboards. So they collected the rates that were being charged by all the utilities in that state, or most of the utilities, and they created some Excel tables, an interactive dashboard that you can click around. So if your state is blue here and you haven't seen that dashboard, let us know. Although, yeah, Erin's got it in there. That's the link you can go on to find this map, and you can click on your state, and it will. That's an example of what a state might use the SRF set-asides for, because it's not benefiting utility X in the state, is benefiting technically the whole state, right? And we'll all be able to see how high our rates are compared to other utilities in the state. Although our rates may need to be the highest, let me be clear about that, right? We need to cover our expenses as a utility. But that's just one example of how some states have used some of that drinking water program set aside. On the clean water side, we don't have these set asides. So what we are thinking, again, me wishing I had a crystal ball, with the IIJA, we expect maybe the set asides would be an important conduit, where if the federal government thinks that this type of project is what they want to push it, hopefully they'll pick green projects like they did, like they introduced back in 2009 with the ARA. And these set-asides are a good way for them to prioritize different projects. But I think I'll move on from there. The next one, so we talked about this one a little bit, some of the set-asides. This next one is a poll/quiz. So states can use the drinking water SRF funds for which of the following, and you get to choose all that apply. And sometimes that's finicky in how, choosing more than one option is set up. But I'll ask our River Network colleagues to launch that poll.
Erin, can you launch that, please? Thank you.
Can you all see that? Yeah, okay.
Yep, and the responses are coming in. And this is great. Nobody is chosen, as I said that. Most people have not chosen operating and maintenance costs, which is good, because that's not eligible. You've got to fund that out of your monthly revenues that you collect from your utility customers, right? You're not supposed to borrow money to pay for O&M, but that was the exception. Most people are doing really well, right? So really the only exception on this is the operation and maintenance. But I remember I just told you, although with drinking water, you can't use it for paying for new growth or building out water lines where there's not growth yet. But we can go ahead and end the poll. In fact, I think I just did that. All right, and so I think folks are seeing the results probably. Okay, good, we'll move on here. So probably going out of order here, but just wanted to kind of give you a visual that we'd come up with for this toolkit. In fact, we didn't come up with it. We gave some ideas. Some people who are good with aesthetics came up with it. But what you're seeing here is how the SRF program works, right? Each piece of the pipe leads to what makes up the state's pot of funding. So the Congress puts some money in, that's the federal piece that we've been talking about. But it's important to know that the slice of that federal pie that your state gets, it's based on these the needs assessment that Alana mentioned before. And I'm pretty confident, I'm feeling optimistic that the Clean Water Needs Survey is also in the nearest future going to get folded into deciding how big a slice of the pie each state gets, right? So just a plug to make sure when those surveys, the drinking water one or the clean water one, when they come to your state, you want to encourage utilities to be doing good asset management, et cetera, so that they can give really comprehensive answers. They know the capital projects that they need in the next 10, 20 years, and they can be really inclusive on these, and that stands to increase the slice of the pie that your state will get. Or maybe make the pie bigger, right? Like this year, we have a much bigger pie than normal. So the states pitch in their 20%. In the toolkit, we do say to a couple states, historically have had trouble, it seems, finding that 20% match. Well, technically, if you don't put in the 20% of non-federal funds, you don't get the federal funds, right? So if you happen to be in a state where you've heard rumors of that being a problem, you want to help support them in getting the state government or whatever to allocate that money so that they can get the bigger pot. And then here on this, you see too a couple examples at a federal level, right, of which types of projects. Well, this is more the entities that are eligible, I should say. So remember though, in some states, it's a shorter list, right? They won't let nonprofits or privately owned systems qualify to borrow from the SRF. Okay, next slide. So tribes and the SRF. So there's a special allocation for tribal communities. It's called the Drinking Water Infrastructure Grants Tribal Set Aside. So this is not to be confused with how I was talking about set asides before. Basically, in the whole federal pot, they set aside some for some of the whole federal pot for tribes. And so they do a drinking, it's partly based on the drinking water infrastructure needs survey that Alana mentioned as to how much will go to probably different tribes, etc. And the Indian Health Service Sanitation Deficiency System report is also comes into play with like who gets what money in there. One of the most important things to stress with this, and I haven't, well, we're still waiting on a lot of information with this new IIJA stuff, and I want to underscore this too, right? So we'll see what comes down and how it's implemented exactly with the tribes. Generally, under the normal current situation, the amount of funding for tribes is pretty low, and so if you have an opportunity to work with tribes and help do some advocacy work for them, they have a lot of need, and COVID really underscored that, right? As to why some of the numbers were so much higher for tribal communities. So that's something that's ripe for work. If there's a question in the chat, I'll hope one of my co-facilitators here, jumps in. I'm just kind of plugging along here. I wanted to sort of underscore, you've been using words like current or traditional versus IIJA, and that's because literally like tomorrow, we can get information on how the current model is no longer, the way to go. So I'll give you an example. There was no green project reserve before in the SRFs, before ARA in 2008, 9, 10, that time period, put it in, and then it became sort of a permanent part of the SRFs, right? So there's been like one webinar, for instance, that's supposed to have happened 3 weeks ago, and they keep pushing it off a little bit. It's supposed to happen tomorrow. If we don't get another, delay notification. And so that's supposed to give a lot of the details of how these IIJ funds will actually roll out. So we're hoping it's not getting confusing talking about the traditional versus, or the current versus what might happen as soon as tomorrow. Alana, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was gonna say, there is a question in the chat. Is this the only federally recognized? Is this only federally recognized tribes? And I believe you kind of touched on that, but I'm not sure.
That's a good question. I believe so, but I don't know if anybody else has more experience than me on here. But since it's federal funds, I would think, and yeah, I would think that it's federally recognized tribes, but maybe somebody knows more about that.
Yeah, I believe, well, when I've been doing research for IIJA, and I do believe they did call that out, but I don't have somewhere to pull it right up just to confirm. So I can't confirm that for you.
Yeah, we'll look at that one and get back to you, and maybe Shada, they can send something out to the whole group. My gut feeling is federally recognized, but again, if it was before, this is the time to change that. This is when I expect a lot of openness and to new ideas, because or to new groups, etc. Because I don't see really feasibly how a lot of these states are going to be able to get this amount of money out of the door, to be honest. Yeah. So let's throw everything in the kitchen sink, and things that were not palatable before may get a good hearing this time. Okay, so the next slide.
There is also a question from Debbie here, and I'm wondering if Debbie, you want to clarify your question too about 14 states to not add to their SRF. And that
Yeah,
must be
I'm sorry, I'm a bad speller and typer, so chat questions are a minefield. So but I am an auditory person. So I think I've heard Katie Hansen say that 14 states don't add to their SRF. And so I think I was wondering if that would mean above the 20% that they have to commit to get the money.
That's a good question, Debbie, and it actually flows into our next slide, Shayla, pretty well, I think. So I'm guessing here what the distinction is, right? So a state will not get that big capitalization SRF grant from EPA if it doesn't pitch in 20% of non-federal money. It's a great deal, so most states have found it, and it is not like a requirement yesterday, right? They've developed ways to find that 20% match. So that's one thing. I believe what KG is probably talking about and what Debbie is referring to is, so some states do a little bit more with their SRFs, and so that's where this slide is going. Some states can leverage their SRFs. They kind of go to the bond market, which we didn't want to go into bonds very much on this presentation today. But they take the money and they leverage it on the bond market, and they have, okay, say they had 100 million that was accessible, that they could loan out to the utilities in their state. They do some investing, let's call it that. They invest the money, and now they have 120 million that they can lend out. And maybe that's where you're getting that 14 number from. And Alana can probably, we had that slide in here and we took it out, like which states do the leveraging is what it's called. It's more work, and it's probably a little bit complicated financial stuff, but a lot of states do it. And I think, so this year might be an exception, or these 5 years, right? But a lot of states have more need. They have more utilities applying for their funds than they have funds to loan out. And so we argue that the states should, like these 14 or so, leverage the money, go to the bond market and make their pie bigger, right? And do more with their SRF dollars. So that might be where that comment and that 14 number is coming from. It's different than the 20%, where states have to match the federal funds at the state level before they can get the federal piece. So yeah, this is just saying that, after the state receives the SRF dollars, they have flexibility in how they distribute the money as well. So states can create policies that determine interest rates, the project priorities. Subsidization is a word that you'll hear. In the SRF world, we don't call it a grant. When we call it principal forgiveness, or it's a partial grant. So the SRF programs have traditionally been low interest loan programs. Starting with ARRA, there is the opportunity to do partial principal forgiveness, or basically you borrow $100,000, but you only pay back, let's say 80,000, right? But you won't hear the staff there calling it a grant, and you don't have a lot of, if you want them to have a lot of respect for you, you don't call it a grant either. It's principal forgiveness, or subsidization is another term that they like to use. And with this new set of funding from IIJA, we will see more of that principal forgiveness or partial grant, right? Okay, so let's see, we could probably, let's stick up to this one a little bit longer. So the state again has some flexibility in how they define a disadvantaged community. So traditionally it was optional, at least in the drinking water SRF. You could come up with a definition of disadvantaged communities, and if you did, you had some eligibility criteria, and then you can give them some negative interest rates, principal forgiveness, partial grant, whatever you want to call it. It's now become mandatory that each state must come up with a definition of disadvantaged. You hear them called DAC sometimes, right? DAC, or California uses the term SDAC, which is severely disadvantaged communities. So each state has to have that definition now, and we're expecting that it fits right in with Justice 40 and all the other goals, at least in theory, that the federal government is saying it has for these funds. So I'm gonna drop a link in here too, because I wanna make sure everybody has this. This came out last week. And remember, I'm trying again to stress, what we're telling you is what's currently, what the SRF currently looks like and how it's been run currently or historically. But tomorrow we may get more implementation guidance on how IIJA is gonna look, right? I'm guessing that one of the reasons, so again, this is just kind of my gut feeling, one of the reasons that webinar on implementing IIJA to the states has been put off is because they maybe wanted to come out with this tool. So Shayna, maybe you could, whoever's sharing screen now, would you mind pulling that up and let's see. This tool came out last week and it's from the federal government and it's specifically looking at disadvantaged communities. So I don't know, try to get a little familiar with it. There is an opportunity, it's a beta. This map is gonna come up, it's an interactive map and you'll see it in a minute. Basically what you're looking at is what may be considered disadvantaged communities are in gray on this map, right? So if you haven't seen this yet, please take a look at it. It's beta, so they're looking for feedback. And I have the feeling that maybe when details on how to implement IIJA come out tomorrow or very soon, that they'll say something like, and refer to this map, you know, if you're not sure about disadvantaged communities in your state, etc. So play around with that. And like I said, there's a form somewhere on here where you can, an electronic form where you can provide feedback. Maybe they were waiting for this to come out first.
I also just wanted to say, yeah, Victoria put in the chat that there is an open public comment period, and I believe this came out on the 18th of February. We were just talking about this, and it's a 60-day comment period, so that should be open still if folks want to go explore it and provide feedback as well.
I believe the link to send in comments is right at the bottom of this page so that you guys can easily find it. Yeah, right there.
And that, I think that takes you can email possibly, but I did see like sort of a Microsoft form at one point. So it's somewhere, that form is somewhere on here and I saved the URL too. If you can't find it, I can get it to you after. But hey, they're looking for feedback, right? And I just, yeah, like Shada was saying, it came out on the 18th. I don't think it's a coincidence that this came out before the details. So states are sitting around waiting for guidance from EPA on, you know, they know how much money they're going to get. You know, they have the allocation out of the 11.7 billion. They know what their state is going to get, but they don't know how to roll it out. They don't know what parameters they have to work with. And so they're all anxiously awaiting that. And I wonder if this tool didn't have to come out before that guidance, but I could be wrong. So yeah, that's something to play around with and give feedback if you can, because we're in that comment period right now. So if we go back to the slides here.
Can you all see the slides now? Cool.
Yeah. It's not in presentation mode, but it's, oh yeah, there we go. All right. Okay, so there's a lot more in the toolkit about doing more with the SRFs, like how to get, you know, should your state be leveraging, etc. I will say this right now, because of the level of funding with IIJA and for the next 5 years, it's probably not where you want to put a lot of your energy because I don't see any state SRF program that's going to go out and try to leverage by bonding their money right now. They have their hands full with this additional funding, right? So let's see, the next slide just kind of gives, I think if we move to the next one, it's a little bit small to read here, but it's a graphic from the toolkit that's showing you of all the different parts of the process, and that, you know, that chart with the purple cauldron or part at the bottom, where you can kind of interject in terms of an advocate. So we focused here on SRF sort of at the state level, but, you know, even your local water utility, you can attend the board meetings there, etc. And and try to, you know, put in some comments and give them some feedback. So that's a nice overview of one of the outcomes of that toolkit. So the next slide should be another poll question.
And I think everyone's seeing the poll on their screen. Again, the question is currently, so based on what it has been, to receive SRF funding, state plans must account for the federal definition of disadvantaged communities. So it's true or false.
Right,
So,
and so,
again,
yeah,
currently.
I'll just, for the sake of time, to kind of jump ahead. So that's false because the states get to decide and define what disadvantaged communities are, right? The federal government so far has not given a definition. They've given criteria and stuff that you could consider as you develop your state's definition. But so that's important to note. All right, on the next slide, if we kind of end off the poll here and move on. Even though we're focused today on the SRF program, that's the goal of the webinar today, there are other forms of federal funding. So the USDA's Rural Development Program, specifically, USDA is huge, but the Rural Development Program within USDA does water, wastewater, and they're doing a little bit more with on-site septic systems or like clusters of, sort of package systems, etc. So look out for more from them. So far, IIJA funds seem to be going to the SRFs. So USDA's rural development is going to have to be a little bit more creative too. So we'll see what happens there. And then they have the National Resources Conservation Service source water protection funding source as well. WIFIA is the next one, the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. And then when it comes to green infrastructure, stormwater, distributed stuff, through 19H grants run at the state level is also important. So it's federal funds that are run at the state level. And there's grants involved. There is a match usually, so don't get your hopes up too high without having some of your own local money or whatever to chip in there. But we wanted to just acknowledge that there are different sources, additional sources, although the SRF is probably the biggest source in each state for water and wastewater and stormwater funding. All right, and then at the local level, of course, local governments and utilities can contribute their own money for water projects. Stormwater utility fees came up a little bit before. Maybe there's going to be a stormwater SRF fund one day, we'll see. But obviously those are to address specifically stormwater needs. Every year we have dozens and dozens more stormwater utilities being created. So that's, if your state or your local government doesn't have one of those, that's something to consider. It's a great dedicated source of funds for stormwater. And yeah, PayGo is just kind of referring to paying for expenses, on a monthly basis as you get your customers paying their bills. And then we have a couple slides next on wells and septic tanks. And we've touched on this already where, oops, next one. Yeah. Homeowners have a hard time funding these things as apart from getting paying for their credit cards or getting a second mortgage on their house, which, I mean, you can't repossess somebody's septic tank. So it's not the most attractive things for local banks to even fund. It's not like getting a car. They'll give you a loan to get a car, but if you don't make your loan payments, they'll take the car back. They can't take your septic tank back. And so it's been kind of a tough area. So we wanted to include a couple resources there. There are a lot of septic tanks. It's a significant number, especially in, we're looking at states like Alaska, where a lot of the households are not on a public system. And even in the metro area, which is highly developed, of Atlanta, I should say, about 12,000 new septic tanks are installed every year. So they're still getting permits to put these in, even though they're really hard to manage and fund the repair and replacement of going forward. All right, the next slide mentions a couple of the sort of generic funding sources that we've seen. We won't get into linked deposit programs too much, but it's an option that can be exercised by some SRF programs. By all SRF programs have the opportunity to do it, but it's a way to get this SRF funds sort of to the homeowner who needs to repair a septic tank. And then the others should seem familiar. USDA has a couple of programs, 319 funds can also be used for that in some cases. If a local organization applies for 319 funds for an area and includes septic tank repair, then it's a go, right? So if you're in a position to do that, the next time you put together a 319 application, consider throwing septic tanks in there. The owners of failing septic tanks will thank you for that later on. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about centralized versus distributed. On the next slide, I think Alana did a good job of talking about this on the first slide that she presented. But if we think about traditional water infrastructure that's centralized, is the treatment buildings, the plants, the pipes, even detention ponds, and it's also kind of called gray infrastructure, right? Where distributed infrastructure is equally important, if not more important, but not gray. It's green roofs, permeable pavements, etc. And it's scattered, which can be a problem for local governments to manage. But it's still important, and we need to keep pushing them towards, managing that type of infrastructure too, and funding those types of projects. Okay, on the next slide, this is a little bit less relevant right now because of IIJA, but traditionally, the federal government like to fund, kind of do multi-funded projects where there's some money from USDA and some money from the SRF coming together to fund the same project, right? And then we had an example on there. On the next slide, I think that's really Shada and River Network to kind of come in there and talk about next steps.
Yeah, really, this was just an opportunity to close out. So I think we're going to put some links in the chat and just a reminder to register for our next session. So this is part of a 3-part series. So our next session, we're going to be talking more about like state level advocacy, going deeper on IUPs and opportunities for influence, talking a lot more about definitions of disadvantaged communities, that sort of stuff, the nitty gritty of getting involved in your state. I'm also just flagging some resources from our website here. I think I've posted in the chat multiple times now that we'll follow up with slides, the recording, links. And then the very last thing is we would love it if you would fill out our training evaluation form to let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, and so we can make some improvement for the next session and in future trainings as well. So I'll follow up with this link on email as well if you don't have time to get to it today. I think that's all I wanted to cover for our closeout. Thank you to stayed with us for the full 2 hours. As you can see, there's a lot to continue talking about. Another reason why we're hosting additional sessions. Each additional session will just be 90 minutes. So thanks for taking 2 hours out of your day to think and talk about SRFs. I hope it was useful. The conversation was great. Okay, take care. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.